Well, I can start off. Yeah. Welcome everyone to our panel discussion. Very appropriately named Sink or Swim, given the outpour outside. Swimming is the only option even coming to the European Studies Centre these days. And I'll just say a few words by opening. First, to introduce myself, Dimitar, Bechev, Director of the Environmental Program for work on Europe in the changing world. For those of you who are curious about what we do, there are papers distributed on China, on Turkey, as well on the US. You're welcome to see them. But back to the subject of our discussion, I want to open with some very recent remarks by my favorite think tanker, someone called Emmanuel Macron, who today gave interview to 7 leading newspapers where he did his usual stuff, providing dose of doom and gloom. He said that in Europe we're living in geopolitical and geoeconomic state of emergency. And also he spoke of the danger of being swept aside, quote unquote, by United States technology and Chinese imports. And he lamented about the openly hostile American administration, which is hell-bent on dismembering, and that's another quote, Europe. We're having this conversation about a year after the famous or infamous speech given by J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Forum. There's another forum this weekend. Let's see what happens there. So this is the tone of the time. But as you see, our papers also covered China. Janka Ortel and I were there on a study trip in November, and there are lots of crowds gathering around this particular relationship, despite our courtship of China, continued engagement on many issues, the danger of Chinese overcapacity of Chinese industrial policy and what it means to millions of workers employed in the automotive sector in Europe is real, and it's being priced in by the Germans. As we speak as well, we have conversations in Abu Dhabi between the Russians and the Ukrainians. One thing which can speak is the absence of Europe in this exchange. The US administration is leading the way, and then you have Budanov and the Russians, but there is no European voice. Now, since there's not all bad news for us, let's remember what's happening on the trade side. We had 2 recent trade agreements, the one with Mercosur, now, of course, sent to the European Court of Justice for legal review. But I was in India with Narendra on another study visit. At the same time, Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa signed another trade deal, the mother of all deals, as Prime Minister Modi called it. So Europeans have been busy working on trade liberalization, engaging in the usual business of promoting cooperation and so on and so forth. All those deals, including the one coming with Australia, are not just about trade, they're about technology, defense, and the whole shebang of issues. But nonetheless, the seriousness of the moment is clear. So what I want to do with this panel is to look at a couple of questions, and feel free to ignore it, and I'll introduce the panelists in due course. First is, what is the scorecard for Europe? And by Europe, we mean the European Union, also the member states, as well as the UK, in dealing with this new world we are facing, where competition, great power, politics is the norm. What are the failures and what are the conditional successes the Europeans, the big family of Europeans have? And what are the trade-offs if we are to engage going forward? In India, it was clear that the conversation about empathy backsliding was not something our colleagues wanted to engage in, except over dinner and off the records. What's happening internally in countries. And India is just one example. There will be many others. you have to probably sacrifice some of the normative agenda for the sake of being competitive in terms of the economy and geopolitical profile. And finally, and still it's a very relevant question, if Europe writ large is involved in promoting multilateralism, what is the end goal there? Obviously, we cannot replace the United States, but what is there to be salvaged from quote-unquote liberal international order? What is the mission and the partnerships? And if we are not happy with the bigger thy neighbor world, want to have something else, what is the realistic alternative, given that we are not going back to the world before? Remember, somebody marked Carnegie. But let me stop my stream of consciousness and then introduce the panel. I don't think there's anybody better, or few people are better placed to discuss those issues at hand. To my favorite thinkers on the big picture in Europe. And they're proper Europeans in the sense that they come, Veronica from Romania, but living in Italy. Then Richard Youngs is a Spanish citizen, I discovered, but one son of Great Britain as well. So between them, they also have this experience of living in various parts of Europe and being able to see the challenges and the situation and political developments from all those kinds of angles. So first start with Veronica Anghel, who is based at the European University Institute. She's worked a lot on the nexus between domestic, internal developments and Europe and the world. So I'll be curious to get your thoughts, Veronica. Sink or swim? What is your... And then,
swim.
And then we get to Richard, who's written on liberal Europe. So we might rework a bit on... And we have both ways, so geopolitics, but also norms and values. But first, over to you, Veronica.
Thank you, Dimitar. It's really an honor to be here. And thank you so much to the Center as well for having us. It's a great week for the European Union. Our hopes are very high that they're at least not going to fight over the things that they need to deliver. But speaking about the EU's role in the world, I want to start by saying a couple of words about this project that we launched at European University Institute, which is a survey that inquires into the, you can easily find it online, that inquires into the aggregate perceptions of global risks to the European Union, where we have about 500 experts who are very well selected and who weigh in on the likelihood and impact of potential risks for the European Union in 2026. We did it also the year before, so you can find it online and see what is the general perception of the people who are also influencing policy in Brussels, but not only. So the highest risks, like on a scale of 1 to 5 on both the likelihood and the impact, is unquestionably the US withdrawal from its security guarantees to European allies. So the experts truly agree on this issue. And then, of course, you have everything else that is connected to threats coming from Russia, including a ceasefire that is favorable to Russia in its war against Ukraine. But I would let you explore this on your own if you are interested. It's really something that is very helpful to see as well, where Europeans place other types of conflicts, like the China-Taiwan potential for a military conflict, which is also perceived as having an above medium likelihood, so pretty high, and close to 4 on the impact line. This is the picture of what is perceived as being high risk to the EU in 2026. But I would maintain our attention to the US withdrawal from its security guarantees to European allies, which also scored incredibly high last year. What did Europe do in the meantime? Since it knew this, or at least there was an aggregate understanding that this was going to happen? Well, I guess not a lot. The other thing that I want you to see as well is while experts would say that a cross-strait military conflict between China and Taiwan is pretty high in terms of likelihood. The Europeans actually see the potential for a US-China direct military confrontation as one of the least likely risks, which can be interpreted as not only do the Europeans not believe in the credibility of US security guarantees to Europe, but they don't think the United States is going to back up its guarantees to Taiwan either. So with this, I think we can stop sharing. You can explore it yourselves. With this kind of a general security landscape that Europeans have not necessarily had to deal with before, I prepared some remarks that I hope that we can consider for the discussion. I think that right now the great powers, we don't talk enough about this, disagree on almost everything, but on Europe, I believe they're quite aligned. They think that the European Union is weak, but not weak enough. And so in this world of raw transactional competition that President Donald Trump and other strongmen imagine that they are building, so Dimitar zero-sum game in the title for today, Washington sees Europe as an economic and civilizational rival. We've already seen this also in their national security strategy. Moscow sees it as an obstacle to its imperial conquest, and Beijing sees it as a regulatory and technological constraint. So you can see different motives, same preference. They want to divide it as strategically timid European Union. I think that the problem with this kind of playbook is that Europe's neither weak nor weakening. On the contrary, I think that Europe has more power than it even admits to itself, and it is beginning to use it. So the fact that threatening to collapse NATO through the use of force against territory held by a NATO ally would, I think, to quote another famous and now of everyone's favorite French person, Charles de Gaulle, he would be surprised, even if he warned that, quote, the Americans will commit all the stupidities they can think of, plus some beyond imagination. And so I think that this administration, arguably even more than Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has activated sources of European power deliberately kept dormant after World War II, which is the armament and geopolitical ambition. So the emerging EU security strategy that we are actually seeing, and this is what I'm arguing, is the equivalent of total defense, which is a whole of society approach that makes resilience, deterrence, and coercive economic tools part of the same project. So it's not only swimming, it's actually swimming, I think, in ways that we can identify as being strategic. So this is not just a security shift. I think it's an identity shift that we see taking place in Europe, and it will reshape not only European identity, but supercharge EU integration as well as expansion. So I think that far from imagining Europe fading under great power rivalry, on the contrary, for the first time in its history, we see a united European great power is coming into view. So I'll make three quick points. I stole 20 minutes. That European weakness is actually a myth, that the EU is moving towards this total defense, whole of society, deterrence by denial strategy, and that the EU is best positioned to actually uphold the best parts of the world order, to answer your third question, and even the United States' better legacy in the world. So first of all, on the myth of European weakness. As we all know, and many in this room have written about this, at the end of World War II, the United States and Western Europe struck a bargain. Western Europeans were going to give up their imperial great power ambitions and step back from the nationalist rivalries that had repeatedly torn the continent apart, and exchange authoritarian rule for liberal democracy. In return, Europeans would receive US economic investment and security guarantees to keep the Soviet Union out, and underwrite reconstruction and peaceful integration through the European project. What followed was a golden age of European growth. Manufacturing output in Europe's core economies multiplied, roughly fivefold in France and West Germany, and close to tenfold in Italy by the end of the Cold War. By 1989, real incomes were roughly 3 to 5 times higher than in 1950, and also average life expectancy in Western Europe had increased by about 10 years. So Europe did not stagnate, it consolidated. At the end of the Cold War, the US-Euro bargain was reaffirmed and extended eastward. As the sole remaining superpower, the United States was supposed to exercise strategic restraint towards its allies, endorse an international order that served its interests, and invest in keeping an economically powerful and democratic Europe anchored in the transatlantic relationship. Europe, in turn, doubled down on everything except hard power. Europeans did not squander this time. They strengthened democracy, welfare states, healthcare, education, infrastructure, human rights, and public administration. Anything but military force and independent geopolitical ambitions. Practically, the Europeans kept their end of the deal. That included remaining militarily weak. The problem is that the success of that bargain trained outsiders to misread Europe. Because Europe chose not to project force, many assumed it could not project power either. I think that the reality is the opposite. The EU has spent decades accumulating a different kind of power. It's the ability to set rules for a market of hundreds of millions, to mobilize capital at scale, to police standards, to coordinate complex supply chains, and when politics turns hostile, to deny access and impose costs. So if you think of it as a state, if it's measured as a state, Europe can look fragile, but measured as a governing system, dense, institutionalized, and in many ways irreversible, it is anything but that. The second point is this idea of where is Europe's strategy going? So how does it swim? I think that what we know now is that the first EU security strategy that Ursula von der Leyen has promised for 2026. I was just on a panel with the Cypriot ambassador to the EU. Cyprus has the presidency of the EU right now, and they're working on it. So they will have a first EU security strategy by the end of June. So this first EU security strategy will matter actually only if it starts from the EU's odd superpower toolkit and its equally odd vulnerabilities. So this will not look like state building at all, and it will not look like what a nation state can do. So if you look for aircraft carriers, expeditionary forces, or kind of single chain of command structures in the European Union, you will miss the point because the EU's comparative advantage is coordination, not command. So for those who have studied military coordination, it's more like commander's intent than command and control. So that is why the strategy that I think is taking shape in Brussels resembles total defense. And what this means is turning regulation and finance and market power into security instruments, blurring the line between civilian and military use of firms of the economy, defense production, infrastructure protection, cyber resilience, supply chain security, and other coercive economic tools are actually being woven together. And the strategic price here, I think, is very important to keep in mind for the Europeans, is not preparedness alone. It's actually deeper integration. I think that pieces of this shift are already visible in EU law and documents. In December 2025, the European Parliament and the Council adopted the regulation creating the European Defence Industry Programme. And this is a part of several programs that aim to leverage up to 800 billion euro in collaborative defense spending across the EU by 2030. But I think that if you actually look into the legalese that the EU is putting out in drones and volumes, the significance of the European Defence Industry Programme lies less in this headline figure than in its logic. So what you can see in the way that it is written is that this regulation explicitly treats the deterioration of Europe's security environment as, quote, an overriding objective of public security that can take precedence over peacetime constraints, including the European Union's so-called do no significant harm principle that is related to climate protection, EU principle for certain defense-related investments. So in total defense terms, this is Brussels saying that things like defense supply chains are critical infrastructure and that holdouts of any nature will not be tolerated. So the regulation also sets a precedent because once, quote, overriding public security is written into the logic of funding and conditionality, a template is now created that any sector can use, including, I would say, critical technologies, energy security, border security, and beyond. So this is where the long run significance of step-by-step legislation lies. Of course, this is hidden from sight. There are many other things that we can look at. I have a whole list here that I want to bore you with. The thing is that the EU is moving at an unprecedented speed to create major things that it didn't do before, including a unified capital market, one of the main obstacles to fully leverage its economic scale. It's cut down red tape through another very strong omnibus legislation, and it will keep doing so. And as Dimitar mentioned, total defense also depends on partnerships with countries that do not conflict with EU security interests. And here too, the EU's approach is structural. Brussels is really baking trusted partners further afield into its financing and procurement schemes. And SAFE, the Security Action for Europe instrument, is explicitly open to participation agreements, even if it focuses primarily on Ukraine. The EU has signed such agreements with, among others, Canada, Japan, and South Korea. The United States is not so far included. And of course, Mercosur, India, so on. I think that it's important also to keep in mind that the EU has identified, again, not explicitly, but the EU has identified Russia as a direct enemy. So, of course, this total defense is a policy designed for conditions short of full peace. So the European Union is not at war in conventional terms, but it is no longer at peace either. And the fact that in December 2025, the EU collectively agreed to borrow on the markets to provide 90 billion euro in support for Ukraine's defense and general budget over the next 2 years, linking it to the repayment of that loan, linking the repayment of that loan to frozen Russian assets held in Europe to be released once Russia is defeated. So there is a between the lines connection between the defeat of Russia and repaying the loan to Ukraine. Now, of course, none of this requires the EU to become a centralized war state. In fact, it cannot because the EU is not a state. Its version of total defense will function more, like I said, like commander's intent and command and control. So they will agree on objectives and standards and funding rules at the EU level. And they will work with member states, and they're already starting to do this, and partners to execute through their own institutions. So you will have EU countries such as Sweden and Finland and Denmark and Estonia and Lithuania, as well as close partners like Switzerland and Norway that already practice total defense and integrated military strength with whole of society resilience. And their experience will matter. What we need to do perhaps now, and I'm involved in some of these initiatives, is to bring them together as well. The bottom line is that the EU's bureaucracy, once designed to constrain the violence that Europeans proved capable in the 20th century, is now being reorganized to enable collective force in the 21st. and to do so through the instruments it already wields best, which is regulation and finance and negotiation and the power of the market. The missing piece of the puzzle, and this is something that we need to talk more about, is the construction of a European we feeling that enables this whole of Europe solidarity in the face of catastrophe. And here is where you have nationalist movements with anti-integration agendas in countries such as Germany, France, or Hungary that pose a real challenge to European unity if they do take power. Nevertheless, I would venture this for discussion. Giving parties such as the AfD, National Rally, or Fidesz too much agency in blocking collective defense efforts would be a mistake. The momentum is moving in the opposite direction. According to the latest Eurobarometer survey released in November, but also through polls that we have at the UI as well, nearly 3/4 of EU citizens, 74%, say that their country has benefited from EU membership, and support for the common currency has reached its highest level ever, which is also at 75%. So nearly 8 in 10 respondents, 80%, support of common defense and security policy, while a large majority of Europeans also support increased defense spending. Polling also shows that close to 56% of EU citizens favor further EU enlargement, with particularly strong backing among younger people, which is important as generations grow. And we also see in the polls that Trump's threats are uniting Europeans further. 83% also agree that the EU should strengthen its economic independence and diversify trade relations with countries all over the world. Now, this lack of confidence that we see in Europeans when it comes to having a role and on the global stage will be even less of a problem as the difference between being at war and being at peace becomes increasingly blurred in practical terms, and the fact that experts identify cyber attacks on critical EU infrastructures as practically imminent threats will further bring this home. Total defense dissolves this line between civilian and the military, and I think this is the direction that we're going in. To conclude, the final point on the EU's role in the world, I think that it's easy to find that elements of an EU total defense strategy predates today's turbulence. And you can see this in debates on strategic autonomy that we talk more about or disagree with. Europeans did not seek confrontation with the United States. Throughout this whole period, they sought insulation and resilience and room to maneuver. And that preference for cooperation has often been mislabeled as weakness. But here to bring another politician who has unexpectedly become a person to look up to as vision for Europe in some ways, the Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever putting after Trump's threats over Greenland, quote, being a happy vassal is one thing, being a miserable slave is something else. So here being actually dependent on a falling United States is totally unattainable. And here the EU's global role is best understood not as classical geopolitics, but what I've written about before, which is to conceptualize it as relational geopolitics, which means practically power, real power in realist terms, but at its exercise through dense networks of rules and markets and institutions and interdependence rather than territorial control. This does not leave aside military dominance. The EU reshaped its environment by structuring incentives, vetting partners, and making exit costly. It sounds different when you are in the UK specifically. So the challenges that Europe faces, to conclude, I would say are not unique. What is unique is the EU's capacity to stabilize relations by design. Over 70 years, the European Union institutionalized peaceful coexistence among historically some of the most violent states in human history. Armed conflict among its members is now unthinkable. And it's important to think that the strategy of total defense that is used to create further EU integration will project deterrence and blunt convergent efforts by Washington and Moscow and Beijing to divide Europe. More importantly, it will not only deepen integration and consolidate European, but it will consolidate European political community as well. And I think that in doing so, and this is perhaps the most controversial part, I think the EU becomes the only actor capable of assuming stewardship of the most valuable part of America's legacy, which is the rule-based order sustained by institutions. The European Union would not have reached this point without the United States underwriting its post-war peace. So maybe now it's Europe's turn to keep the house running while America is at war with itself.
Thanks, Veronica. That's the dose of optimism we do need in the middle of February. And this, well, before I pass to Richard, is to be the party pooper and say yes, buts, and of course there is total defense, but then again, if you look at the capabilities the Europeans have, we're lagging behind in many of those, and still depend on America. I mean, that whole discussion about Ukraine reassurance force is very indicative of how much we need, and we're looking at 10 years at least in this political will to develop those capabilities. And things like satellite intelligence, deep strikes, unmanned platforms, and missile defense. Second, in political economy, but also in security, we have the perennial issue of collective action. Right? I mean, right now they're discussing the single market not being complete, and the Draghi report not being implemented. So there's so much slack we can pick domestically, but there's inertia, there's national egotism, vested interests that prevent Europeans from being together. And lastly, of course, we can engage in defense, but so many of those challenges are not about armor, right? It's also about those new threats. For example, the FSB, messing up the train system in Poland or the electricity grid. And I think Europe has the capacity to counteract. But it's not a given that we'll get there anytime soon, and our competitors might be ahead of us. So let's park there, and I'm sure you have your thoughts on this. Aspect, Richard, I mean, what's interesting about Richard's work over the years, and I encourage you to bring norms and domestic democracy into the conversation. Is now we're all talking about security, geopolitics, interests, and so on and so forth. But are we not at the risk of throwing the baby with the bathwater, because many of those concerns are still very pertinent. At the end of the day, whether we are capable to act depends on the health of our democratic institutions as well. Something that Veronica alluded to as well. Forward to you, Richard.
Probably just say yes and close it there. But thanks for the invitation. So yes, I work in a think tank in Brussels called Carnegie Europe. And I run something there called the European Democracy Hub. So I've been following how all these challenges have been digested at the policy level in Brussels, and I very much agree with Dimitar that there is a sense that we stand at an inflection point, and there is a spirit of change that is on the agenda now to a far greater extent than for many years. I'm pretty much in line with Veronica. What I've tried to do is just tease out some of the conceptual questions that I think flow from her arguments about European hard power and investments in security over the last couple of years. My answer is the same. Europe will swim, not sink. I think the pertinent question is whether the EU needs to adopt a different style of swimming in order to survive and prosper in the emerging order. Probably sounds pedantic, but I think the first challenge is to understand well the diagnosis of what's actually happening in the world, what changes it is that oblige the EU to change its international identity, I think part of what's happening internationally is the emergence of a more zero-sum order, but I don't think that's the only thing that's happening. I think at the moment we stand in an order that's very mixed and eclectic and fluid. There are political philosophers, John Gray and others, that Timothy has debated with, who would insist that we are definitively now in a post-liberal order. We may be heading that way. To me, it seems a little bit premature at the moment to think that that is the only kind of dynamic at play. So it seems to me that all the traditional classical ways of describing international order fall short, that there's no single template that can capture everything that is going on at the moment. Zero-sum dynamics are very powerful, but they're not the only thing that's happening. We're not quite in a purely multipolar world order yet. Spheres of influence are emerging, but again, there's a lot of things that are happening that don't quite fit that model. Clearly, the liberal order of previous years is no longer, but there are still very, very mixed dynamics in a very eclectic international picture. We can debate that academically in a policy sense, and that means that for the EU, the challenge is to try and adapt a kind of model that takes on board all these different, very varying, contrasting international dynamics. So I think the challenge goes a little bit beyond it simply being a zero-sum challenge or adapting to a zero-sum world. I would say the EU has actually been adapting to this changing picture for quite some number of years. This is not a completely new challenge that has arisen with Trump. I'd say for the best part of a decade, the EU's been trying to develop these sharper instruments of power and developing a slightly more mixed international identity. The traditional picture you will all know is that the EU is still a rather pristine liberal power that has naively not moved with the realpolitik of the era. To some extent that is true, but I think that traditional standard picture is somewhat overstated. For a decade, the EU has been engaging in quite a lot of realpolitik itself and looking out for its interests in a rather more instrumentalized fashion. Clearly, it may need to go further in that, but I think that the sense of the EU trying to adjust to the changes in global order with a more mixed picture in its international identity has been around for some time. I try to describe this as geoliberal, so the notion that the EU is now seeking to instrumentalize its security power, often around the defense of at least some parts of international order. That's not a particularly original thought. Many writers have suggested that the future will be a question of the EU combining different kinds of dynamics, relational geopolitics, and other writers have suggested other dynamics. So I think it's clear that's the kind of direction the EU is moving in. The Ukraine invasion already acted as a very strong catalyst for the EU to think in more instrumental terms about the deployment of its economic statecraft, its market power, to revert to some kind of use of hard power, to think more in terms of the control of political space and how that relates to its adversaries, the reopening of the enlargement process with a much more geopolitical dynamic, and to think about the strategic value of its own norms and values. So I think that was given a kind of catalytic prompt forward by the Ukraine invasion. The question, it seems to me now, is whether what's happening with Trump makes this kind of geoliberal synthesis of different strategic logics more or less relevant. It seems to me it does make it more relevant. I think a lot of what the EU is trying to do is exactly as Veronica was describing, to sharpen its use of power for very, very tangible reasons and uses. But the narrative behind that is now that the last vestiges of the liberal order are so obviously under threat now, not just from Russia and China, but from our erstwhile ally as well. So I think there is an inflection point, which is forcing the EU to try and think through how to render this kind of synthesis more effective in the future. But my argument, basic would be this. I think there's a recognition that this is the direction that European governments individually and the EU collectively need to move in. But I can see the EU struggling actually to get this kind of balance and synthesis right. It seems to me at the moment, responses to the Trump administration and all the geopolitical threats or risks that come with that is still rather narrow. We may agree on the vision we want to get to, but I can still see a lot of weaknesses and shortcomings in terms of the policy responses so far. You all know the overwhelming framing of European debates at the moment is that the EU needs more independence and autonomy. I think we all agree on that. It seems a kind of no-brainer at the moment that the EU needs that, the kind of security of that independence and autonomy. But it seems to me that's not an end in itself. That doesn't necessarily address what for me is the really difficult, thorny conundrum of what the EU seeks to do with that independence and autonomy. Is this autonomy independence a purely defensive concept to defend European territory? Does it have a more proactive element to it about refashioning a different kind of global order? Is it independence in order to dovetail with a more zero-sum global order? Or is it to develop a kind of conceptually different notion of power in contrast, in opposition to the way that other powers are operating? I don't think yet the EU has really clarified what the ultimate purpose is. For me, this is frustrating because it means the debate, to my mind, gets stuck a little bit on this rather narrow point of we need to be tough, we need to be assertive. Indeed, yes. But that only seems to me to take us a few first tentative steps in terms of mapping out the kind of vision, the kind of swimming style that the EU needs to adopt in order to prosper over the longer term. So yeah, when I agree with Veronica on this, the dynamic, the dominant dynamic we know at the moment is securitization in European debates. We can all probably agree a dose of securitization is needed. There is a risk, perhaps it goes too far, that EU still needs a lot of extra capacity in order to effectively defend itself. But it seems to me securitization is necessary, but it's not sufficient in terms of understanding what kind of vision the EU has for a longer term mapping of power projection in the world and what kind of international order might emerge from the current turbulence. My concern is that the focus on securitization, of course, is necessary. I don't want to be misunderstood, and I'm saying it is a necessary part of the equation, but there is a slight risk that it's crowding out at the moment all the other components that are also necessary for the EU to develop in terms of a more effective projection of power. The same with economic security. The EU is now certainly developing a more assertive kind of economic statecraft. We can all agree it needs the investment in economic competitiveness, its own industries, in order to use its market power as a kind of strategic leverage. But it doesn't seem to me as yet that the EU is doing that much to bring its economic and its security dimensions, objectives, really together in a properly coherent fusion. It talks a lot about doing this, and that this being the ultimate goal of European external policy. But if you look at the concrete record, I'm not sure the EU is necessarily doing much in that vein, at least yet. You all know that the big reaction to the Trump administration, the Trump challenge, is that the EU is making a big effort to find other alliances, other partnerships around the world. It has struck now 7 or 8 new security and defense partnerships around the world. These are clearly a good thing, whether it be with India or other powers. Still, it seems to me that most of these agreements are a little bit thin when you look at the concrete substance that they include. And the headline importance that's given to them often is a little bit ahead of what they actually do in political terms, in terms of their kind of detailed substance. Most of these agreements are mainly about exchanging defense procurement rules and cooperating on security and developing defense capabilities. They don't, to my mind, look as if they're particularly liberal agreements. They're sold as agreements, new alliances to defend liberal order against the United States, but most of the substance they include is actually not very liberal at all. That leads on to a big point that's being debated at the moment, particularly in the US. What's very, very flavor of the month at the moment is an assumption that a lot of the global order will hinge around the so-called middle powers. That if we have China and the US both run by increasingly personalistic, illiberal leaders, that it will be on the shoulders of middle powers to defend some kind of rules-based order. This is problematic and challenging for the EU. Obviously, the EU will be part of this trend towards middle power diplomacy. But we should remember that most middle powers are not democratic. Most middle powers don't have a very liberal conception of global order. And of course, the middle powers concept is quite challenging for the EU as a collective entity, because individual European governments may count as middle powers. How many of them would be an interesting debate, but clearly the EU as a collective entity would aspire to being a little bit more than just one middle power compared to other middle powers. So if the future is one of middle power diplomacy, trying to be a kind of defensive shield against the US and China, I think there's still a lot of debate to go through in order for the European side of that equation struck in the right kind of way. So in all those senses, I think that the EU is moving in the right direction. There's much more, as Veronica was saying, much more strategic awareness in the EU in terms of the EU trying to strike the right kind of balances in its external policies. I just finish off suggesting that the one area where you can see these trade-offs and balances being struck and the real difficulties in getting these balances right is in the field of democracy. And I just mentioned this briefly because in Carnegie, this is where we're putting a lot of effort. And you all know, it seems to me, this is where we've seen the most alarming change or reversion under Trump, both because of the US's internal authoritarian turn, but also because the US has stepped back completely from supporting democratic values internationally. You all know it's cut its funding for democracy projects almost entirely. Indeed, it almost seems to be championing non-democratic powers more than democratic powers internationally. The EU has said it's positioned itself now as a more primary defender of democratic values around the world. But if you look at the substance, the EU has not really stepped up to any great extent to fill the gap of the US pulling back from supporting democratic organizations around the world. Unfortunately, most European governments themselves have cut funding for democracy projects quite significantly, even as the Trump administration has cut its funding. The UK, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, Norway all cut their democracy budgets quite significantly since Trump came to power. The Spanish are an exception. They've been just kind of moderately increasing their democracy budget. So there are some new players emerging. But very, very interestingly, at this moment, last year was a story of Trump taking power, but it was also the story of an unprecedented, you've written about this, unprecedented wave of democracy protests around the world. So there's a lot of demand still for support for the democratic reforms. And the EU, it seems to me, is still not really fulfilling that demand as it steps back and tries to adjust to this zero-sum world. The one big initiative that the EU has introduced since Trump came to power in the democracy field is its so-called democracy shield. And this reveals all of the things we've been talking about. The democracy shield is there to defend Europe's own democracy from external threats. It is not there to try and help democratic reforms and democratic norms internationally. To me, that seems to crystallize the spirit of this current era. So I'll leave it there. Dimitar, by way of a very maybe simplistic conclusion, I would say, I think the EU is heading towards being a kind of toned down, a more moderate liberal power, as you said at the beginning. The challenge is for it to get the balance right, for it not to go too far away from its previous identity as a liberal power. The EU leaders will talk about the need for more global projection. I think the EU is actually set to become perhaps more of a regional power and double down on defending its own regional order against the threats coming at it internationally. And then, as you said at the beginning, I think the right balance, the real challenge is to strike the right balance in in relation to the United States, to make sure that the EU is sufficiently assertive against the US, but not to think that in itself is a strategic vision for the longer term. The EU needs to be not just against what Trump is doing, but itself have a positive vision in terms of understanding where this very eclectic world order we're going through at the moment develops in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard, for those all those points. I want to pick up on three in particular. First one is the story about yesterday. It's not entirely correct. The EU being a nice liberal power. I mean, if you ask Frontex and its customers, maybe that's not the case. Or if you ask the Indians, for that matter, in India, we discovered that France has become the second largest defense partner in terms of exports for India after Russia, but the Russian share is declining and the French share is increasing, including Rafale planes and submarines and the whole array of products. So there is a real politics side to Europe we don't want to talk about, but now it's a bit more kosher to discuss. Second point, securitization. Sounds great until we acknowledge that they are trade-offs. In the old days, we talked about security versus civil liberties. That's that post 9/11 discussion. But now these days, it's okay. We can be independent, securitize our economic policy, but it means that if you go to the supermarkets, it will cost you. So economic prosperity might be exchangeable for security as well, and that's something that both Americans but also Europeans have to live with. Final point is striking with small middle powers, that Europe might not be entirely comfortable with being a middle power, because middle power, by definition, at least that's my reading, I might be totally wrong, this parochial. You care about your own regional ghetto, right? You don't have a globalist agenda. Whereas, to my mind, Europe is, again, maybe by habit, not by actual practice, is into the business of projecting norms which are universal, those universal side to Europe. So I guess one overarching question is what remains of universalism? And to raise this question here, because I remember at least 20, 25 years of conversations in this very room about the nature of universalism and the pitfalls and problems, but is there anything remaining of it? But maybe I just turn back to you now with questions. I mean, Veronica, you've written really large, but I know you probably won't go on to discuss that much this aspect, but let's come back to it for a second. Now it's fashionable again. It's about geopolitics and security. But what of this transformative agenda? It's speaking of trade-offs. So opening the doors for many more countries, like our friend David Rama, who's had the most pleasant character, might be sitting in Brussels, and he's not an exemplary development, put it that way. Are we facing this problem that in order to build up our defenses, we have to be open to dealing with people we might not be with, and we might have another Hungary in 10 years' time elsewhere on the European periphery?
Okay, so and that's an excellent question. It's a clear example of a potential for a trade-off. I think that enlargement is part of the EU's geopolitical tools. I think that it does not exist solely it was never about altruism. On the contrary, it is entirely for the European Union to justify to secure its own interests. The way that enlargement has evolved right now is in a way that it seems to put security at the center, particularly in relation to Ukraine. That is because there are so many things that are happening in practice that look like enlargement has already taken place, with Ukraine's access to a lot of the things that used to be saved for later on when they would become members. And it is part of how the European Union projects this sort of relational geopolitics that I'm talking about, but also how it projects deterrence. Why am I saying that? Because if the European Union is connecting its economy to the economy of a country that is being attacked by Russia in this case, then it puts skin in the game. And in principle, it should also work as a deterrent for Russia to know if you attack Ukraine, you also attack the European interests. So the more that happens, the more it is likely to deter, according to this model, if we believe it, it's more likely to deter Russia. It's also more likely to deter China in the future. Where would China place its economic interests? The incoming China shock, we don't talk about too much, but I think if we don't start learning Chinese quickly, we will be again caught on the back foot, because that is the actual challenge that we are dealing with. Whereas Russia is nothing, honestly. I mean, it's the least about concern. I cannot believe we're dealing with the Russians again. Honestly, come on. So yeah, enlargement is part of how we're going to move forward. We already saw there are different models related to enlargement that are coming as proposals from the European Union. This kind of reversal enlargement is the latest that we read in the news about. Many of us have been writing about this for a long time, so I get the whip that, maybe you don't want to talk about this because we've been talking about this for so long that it's still, in the works, but now it's dripping inside in the policies of the European Union. And the way we move forward is by making sure that the idea of getting other Orbans or other states that are likely to interfere with decision making in a coalition building format, in a constructive format, will not take place. So I think the challenge is institutional and it's political. It's not about the trade-offs of values on the country, enlargement improve symbolism in the substance of European values.
Richard?
Yes, I think the proposal that's actually made by the EU today for this reverse enlargement actually goes in the right direction. For those of you who weren't following it, the idea, basically the EU committed to a new wave of enlargement years ago now, over 3 years ago. And nothing much, the progress since then has been relatively slow. When the new process of enlargement was opened up, lots of people were saying that the challenge was for the EU to kind of reinvent enlargement. And at that level, it seems to me nothing much has changed. But now there's a proposal that would entail quite a significant change. The idea would be that essentially the EU would let in candidates. It's not lowering the threshold in terms of democratic reforms, but saying you come in and then if there's democratic backsliding, you don't stay a member of the democracy. So it'd be very, very difficult to make work. Still, there's still a lot of details to be fleshed out. But it seems to me that that's the kind of arrangements that's needed. Not as Veronica saying, not so it's just a binary trade-off between the norms and all that strategic value, but to understand investing in the norms and values and democratic reform processes is a source of geopolitical advantage for the EU. In terms of that links to your question about universalism, because the area where the EU has actually been investing a lot more in democratic reform processes is in the immediate neighborhood. It's more universal, it's more global spending has actually declined, but it's actually making more of an investment closer to home. In terms of the global funding, there is still a degree of universalism left. The situation for democratic reforms around the world is really bad. It's the EU's ambition today is lower than it was because the situation facing democratic activists around the world is just so horrendous today. So a lot of what the EU is doing today is just trying to keep democratic activists safe, to get them out of their countries, to help them with legal support, digital security. It's not the same kind of agenda as 10 or 15 years ago when it was about transposing and whole institutional templates to other countries. But that's a sign of the times, and there the EU is still doing a good job. But in terms of these more ambitious templates of institutional reform, I can see the EU focusing much closer to home. If you look at the Middle East and North Africa, the EU, at the same time as it was investing a lot more for the candidate countries, the EU came up with a new pact, new strategy for Middle Eastern states, new pact for the Mediterranean, as the EU calls it, last year. And it's that has a very, very transactional feel to it, and it doesn't have very much of these kind of value-based policies at all. So I think the balance there will differ quite significantly between regions in the future.
I'm sure there will be questions. The audience, next to row. Shirak, introduce yourself before you ask the question.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shirak. I'm a visiting researcher, and I'm co-founder of Yerevan Center of Foreign and Security Policy think tank. So I have two questions, basically. The first one is about the EU independence and economic independence. So when we are saying that there is changes, but at the same time we have the situation that this summer Ursula von der Leyen signed a deal with the US with the investments and the energy deal, which is giving quite weapons to the US for leverage and also making EU dependent on the US. Do you think this kind of actions are supporting it? And so far as I know, some EU governments, they were not really positive about this, but like under down. And the second question about the cognitive warfare that EU is in, and it's not a new thing. It's I think coming from 2014, 15, maybe 16. So how the EU is fighting? Because if before it was China and Russia, so now this cognitive warfare is also coming from the US, and we can see from Trump's level, from vice president level, and the others and others, how the EU is fighting on this cognitive warfare. So thank you very much.
This is actually the business center. Thank you very much for your presentations. And I'm just wondering whether we're looking at democracy and how Europe is going to the future in terms of the challenges that there are and power politics. But the reality is that most European democracies these days are surviving by the skin of their teeth. I mean, there's so many kind of risks that you may have alternative populist kind of governments that will take power. That completely then disturbs our projection and our understanding. And we need probably to think also of what's happening within Europe and the socioeconomic basis of those weak democracies. Because there's one thing obviously that Trump is becoming very, very strong, but the populations in Europe actually are thinking of their own economy. And this is a case here in Britain. I mean, people are going to the Reform Party, not because Trump is becoming more threatening to them, but because the economy of this country is so weak and the lack of growth in Europe. So I think that, that is an explanation that gives us a lot there. And I was wondering how what you think about it when you study democracy and democratic politics.
Okay, let's come back to the panelists and then I'll collect more questions. Veronica, kick us off.
Right. So, Shirak, your question about EU economic independence, I think that we've been talking about this, it's a process. At this point, there is a momentum among the population. There is a set of decisions that are being taken at the EU level. It is a slow process and it does not rise to the occasion. It has been activated more in the last year or so. In a way, you asked the question whether the EU was too subservient to, let's say, the United States for too long, including signing this trade agreement. And I know that there was so much judgment on Ursula von der Leyen. There isn't much else she could have done at that point, because this is just not how the EU works. That she did not have a mandate to do more than she did. And in a way, the Europeans have, I believe, done their best to talk a drunken United States off a ledge and try to keep it in check for as long as possible, to buy themselves time to create other alternatives. There is no really a choice. They did not want to antagonize the United States. There has been I think it's difficult to accept how crazy politics coming from the United States are right now, but when most people you talk to, it's just unbelievable how the extent to which they're shooting themselves in the leg on a world order that has made them nothing but richer. The fact that they distributed that richness totally wrong and that created inequalities in society, this has more to do with their internal governance schemes than how the world order that they have built together with European assistance has helped them. So I think it's the EU has been slow to wake up that to the realization that this is not a blip in transatlantic relationships, but it's this change is here and it's a structural shift. It did not start with Trump. The transatlantic relationship has had problems for a much longer period of time, but it has now been raised to a completely different level. The question about cognitive warfare is something that a strategy of total defense can respond to. This is in the works in many ways because it cannot just be nation-based. It has to go through whole of society efforts across the EU, and it's going to take a very long time. I don't think that they are fighting it seriously right now, that at the EU level, right? So we can go state by state, and that looks different. But at the EU level, they're still fighting a 21st century problem with 20th century solutions without really regulating social media platforms, without really intervening. You could probably tell us more given your role in the institute chair. But at this point, the ground is being set up, I believe, better, and that includes separation from the United States in many of the areas where the United States is still.
It's probably not separation, but different. I mean, if you parallel with the debate on China, it's not decoupling, it's de-risking, because the US can go in many different directions. So it's not a threat. It is a threat now. It might not be a threat tomorrow. We don't know. So
I think it's separation because the weaponization of even the flow of information and the data that the United States is controlling for European is something that needs to be dealt with when the United States is this hostile to European governments.
Yeah, but I mean, to be the devil's advocate, if you ask Trump, yeah, that's probably the case. If you ask Gavin Newsom, he might say United States is not just Washington, it's California as well. And we have pluralist country, you have various constituencies, and there's work to do. Except that on the European side is, yeah, can you put all your eggs in a basket and bank on Newsom becoming president? Maybe you can cash in a big way, but that's what risk delivers to you. So US has become a gamble. So de-risking is the strategy. You want to have other options. And I think that's the game we're playing. Maybe Richard.
And just one brief point on the democracy issue. I very much agree. I think the problems facing European democracy, not just external, they're internal, they're not just exogenous, they're endogenous to the way the system works itself. It's also not simply a question of the populace threatening democracy. I mean, people have written about this. At the policy level, however, I think the easiest area where governments can make progress is on controlling external influences coming on online manipulation, FEMI operations. Pretty much all member states now have defending democracy plans or action plans of some kind. And they all focus overwhelmingly on that dimension. Information space, preserving democratic information space, trying to contain malign influences, online influences coming at Europe from abroad. And clearly that is needed. It's about better regulation of social media. I think on this area, I'd say the EU has actually made a bit of progress. It needs to make more progress. This is where the democracy shield is particularly good and particularly focused. That's a necessary part of the equation. All the democracy civil society organizations say the EU's gone a little bit too far and been rather too restrictive in a way that actually risks the quality of Europe's own democracy in the name of fending off external threats. But it's a very, very difficult balance to get right. But I agree that that is a necessary part of the equation, but the weaknesses to European democracy are just also intrinsic to the way that European politics works. I don't think it's just a question of economic growth. I mean, there have been many countries that have recorded very healthy economic growth over the last decade, but have suffered quite significant democratic backsliding. Poland is one in Europe, or Israel, or Brazil when it went through its Bolsonaro period. So there's not actually much of that stronger correlation between economic growth and democratic quality. There's a whole range of factors. It's very, very complex. But I think it's that part of the policy challenge that is proving more challenging for the European Union institutions really to get a grip on.
Right. Marcin,
Quick question.
can you introduce yourself?
Yes, Marcin Walecki, a business scholar with Oscar, excellent talk, Veronica. Just wanted to ask you from your perspective, I mean, the last few years, all these crises, does Brussels, Paris, and Berlin still look at Romania, Bulgaria, Poland as the peripheries, or are they starting to see this as a sort of like a very vibrant part of the solution of what is happening to you? And we could example, of course, with the Baltic states, and definitely, new NATO member states, Finland and Sweden. And second question, in your talk, what role do you see for Norway in all those, construction vision for Europe? Norway has been making 150 billion euros every year since the war started, was getting really started in Europe. This is a total of 600 billion euros just on oil and gas. This is not just for the foreign construction rebuilding of Ukraine. So obviously Norway will be an important part of the vision. Richard, your favorite dimension, third dimension, human dimension, democracy shield. And what are the lessons learned from US departure from democracy support? And we need to prioritize. Need to see Brussels apparently talk about prioritization. 6 priority countries for which EU should focus now. We have to stop supporting and promoting, democracy globally because we do not have the resources to do it to the level the US was doing it. So is prioritization something which we need to do now? And Dimitar, to you, would Turkey defend NATO in case Russia were to attack Estonia? Because Turkey was not.
That's an easy one.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating and presentation.
Could you please introduce yourself?
I'm the Carnegie St. Antony's European Centre for some time. Two observations really, both many. One is someone mentioned it, but only en passant. That is the importance of economic strength, because you get dictators when your economies do badly, or the Reform Party, or whatever. Maybe that is an area that the EU more interested in. Individual countries, yes, but collectively, how can we boost the economic strength? And the other thing is, Russia is the element in the room, but hardly anyone has mentioned it specifically. Recently, in a mentoring capacity, gave a talk to a group of 6 foreigners, basically to encourage them to apply to universities in like Melbourne or so forth. And the big question, several of them said, is there any point in going to university when we may end up being conscripted to fight a war against Russia? That's so I say so, one or two points. The panel all seem to be saying the EU needed to protect itself against the United States. But I think we have a much more imminent and dangerous enemy.
Richard, let's start from you.
No, I think my impression is that European governments are very acutely aware of their risk from Russia. In fact, the European defense budget is going to increase again after 2022. So I think it's a recognition that Russia is likely to be the main threat. But as Veronica laid out, we don't have the same kind of hard security dependency. So the policy challenge is just quite qualitatively different. I think on the I think with Russia, it is about these hybrid threats. I think it took a long time for the European governments and the EU to wake up to just how existential and systemic these hybrid threats were. But I think now that's on the agenda, and the budgets for cybersecurity units and so on and so forth are now huge, and that's where a lot of priority attention is being given. I think the withdrawal of US diplomatic resources and money from all these kind of normative agendas around the world is a big shock for Europe. The US was spending about $3 billion a year on democracy issues. Add all the European money together, it's probably a little bit more than that, between 3 and 4 billion euros. So Europe would need to practically double its investment in order fully to compensate for the US, which it's not going to do. As I said, the main European donors are actually also cutting back their aid. So resources, money is tight. Money is very, very tight. And I think you almost kind of answered your own question. There does need to be prioritization. The EU does a lot of really good work on democracy. Right? Its democracy budget is about 200 million a year, and it's split between 60 or 70 countries. So when you divide it up, you don't get a lot of money per country, not enough to generate any kind of real impact or tangible critical mass. I think in the future, the EU, individual European donors won't be able to do as much in as many countries around the world, and there will need to be prioritization. And my impression is that the EU is already moving in that direction. European leaders won't admit that. They will still say that they're committed to every region around the world. And there's a summit one week in Central America, and Central America is the absolute priority. And then it's India is the absolute priority. And then it's Africa. Africa Union is the absolute priority. But I think in practice, there will be more focus on slightly a select number of issues and themes and countries and regions. But I think with the US being so hostile at the moment and actually undercutting a lot of work that the Europeans are doing, it will be very, very difficult. There's a lot of work going into not just keeping the money flowing, but also trying to build new alliances with other democratic powers. So I would say that the big focus is an interesting lens to look at. It's not so much the middle powers diplomacy, but whether there's any appetite left for coming up with some kind of better coordination between democratic powers, whether they're big, medium, or small. I don't quite see that at the moment, but there's a lot of talk about it, at least at the official.
Oh, quickly on Russia, I also don't think that there's any doubt in Europe left that Russia is the enemy that is moving us towards increasing defense spending. But the reason why you identified, Robert, correctly, that I put the emphasis of the United States, because even if previously Russia had been identified as a threat, the United States security umbrella was there to give comfort and to also create a certain level of complacency when it comes to independence. Since that is no longer credible, it is rather an amplifier of this way towards independence. But there is no doubt that Russia is the enemy that everybody is looking at. And I think that poll that I showed at the beginning also identifies most of the threats in the expert community as well as coming from Russia, including a ceasefire that is favorable to Ukraine. And in that sense, the United States has become more of an obstacle. I've been arguing that the United States should just at this point go focus on China and let us deal with Ukraine in constructive ways, because they're doing more harm than good at this point. Martin's question, I think, is just the moment for you've set me up to say, I think Poland is no longer in the periphery, but the other countries still are. Maybe that's
Romania is coming up.
No, Romania is not going anywhere, unfortunately. We had the Minister of Foreign Affairs this morning, and nope, not doing very well if you want to listen to them, what kind of focuses they have. So no, I think Poland is included in a core coalition in ways that the other countries are not, mostly because of Poland's decision to be a part of the coalition of the willing, to be a part of all these different ad hoc groups that are forming towards further integration. And it's more of a constructive partner with issues but the other countries are just not present. The politics of Romania are now moving in a good direction, even if they survive by the skin of the teeth through very creative constitutional decisions. Bulgaria is a perpetual case of instability that I think maybe we should speak more about. The conversation on Norway is very interesting because you would think that enlargement to Norway, I mean, that if Norway would want to join, we would not have the sort of problems that we have with other states. That debate has started. I've seen it a few times, but the majority of Norwegians have not only historically opposed membership, but even now the polls don't show that that referendum would pass. So I think they're going to stay focused on the economic area, European economic areas, active members, and then ties, and actually pay more because they're not part of the decision making, setting up the rules, but they're happy to do so. On Ukraine, they are giving about 25 billion and it's going up. So they are investing there. And together with Denmark and other countries in the north, they're also investing in joint, mostly defense industries. But you could tell us more about what's happening in Ukraine.
Timothy Garton, European Studies Centre. I wanted to ask you to reflect more deeply on a concept that you both mentioned very positively: rules-based international order. In fact, Veronica, it was in your peroration at the end, rules-based international order. And I just want to ask if this is really the central concept we want to put on our European flag. At least three possible objections. Number one, nobody's heart ever beat faster. Present company possibly excluded, rules-based international order, and certainly no one I know would risk their life to fight for rules-based international order. So just as an emotional appeal, that's not very effective. Second objection, very striking. Mark Carney's famous speech, he held up rules-based international order as an example of a public lie of the kind Václav Havel was attacking. Double standards. And even the EU, which is the most advanced example of rules-based international order. Well, hang on a tick. The Eurozone, if there was one rule for Germany and France and another for Greece. You just mentioned Romania, creative constitutional court interpretation. The history of the EU is full of creative interpretation and bending of rules. Third objection, I mean, the story we've all been telling is of an EU which is becoming more realistic in terms of more pragmatic, more hard-nosed, more, if you like, transactional. And we really want to double down on rules-based as the heart of the answer to your question, Richard. What is it all for, to defend it? Now, you may say, what's the alternative? Well, one alternative would be, to put it in academic terms, norms rather than rules. Or to put it more accessibly, what Andrew Schoenfeld called the habits of international cooperation. So what we stand for in Europe is that we always try to resolve conflicts by peaceful means, by negotiation, by making jaw rather than war. That seems to me a more defensible claim, but actually a more comprehensible and accessible and even inspiring one than rules-based, but convince me otherwise.
I must say your take on rules is very much Germanic and not the common law tradition, which is rules are based on precedent and process and open to interpretation.
But it's not my take, it's the EU's take.
Yeah, fair enough. David.
Thank you very much. David Madden, ESC. Thank you for two excellent presentations. Can I ask about the evidence from opinion polls? Is there any evidence of increased support for a European defence identity, which is separate from NATO?
Timothy's question is enormously complex, but I think it goes to the heart of the difficulties the EU, but individual governments having as well, and other middle powers. It seems to me that I kind of share the skepticism, and space order is not a particularly stirring slogan to organize, and mobilize the project of European integration, and in particular because different countries have such different understandings of what the rules-based order is. So I've been struck over the last year about how many IR scholars are arguing that the liberal order is not completely finished. What we are heading towards is a kind of thinner version, a much thinner version of that order, based on a much more selective adherence to rules around pragmatic cooperation, so that when powers perceive that they need to cooperate to get something done, then they will be willing to adhere to certain rules with a degree of selectivity. But it won't be about the kind of big stirring normative agendas. It will be where they perceive a kind of shared interest in making concrete progress. It seems to me that kind of consensus amongst IR scholars is taking shape around that idea, which in a way is the opposite of what you're saying. It's a more procedural understanding of order and less rooted in norms, certain political norms. To me, that seems slightly risky because it excludes from that script all the political developments that are taking place across the world, where certain political norms are mobilizing and stirring people into action. We're aware of the argument that we need to be more pragmatic, and Europe can't do nearly as much to support these kind of norms internationally. But I just wonder if it's a kind of misreading, more or less going in the line you were intimating it. It's a little bit of a misreading of what's going on globally to suggest that what powers want is a kind of very procedural notion of rules-based pragmatic coordination that is somehow separable from the politics that is going on within their own constituencies, their own nation states. That seems to me to unlearn a lot of what previous IR scholarship taught us about the interlacing of domestic and international politics. So in fact, in what we've been trying to map out, we talked about this before in Carnegie, was to try and get away a bit from this notion that you can have a rules-based order that is not this separate from any kind of notion of political norms or universalism of norms. Because if you look around what's happening around the world, still people are being motivated by certain political objectives, quite separate from what's going on in the United States. So it's kind of concurring that it doesn't seem to be the right way to think about it. Right.
So I think this is not me. I am silent. Just
The Russian hackers.
Russians.
They got you finally.
So
Romanian hackers.
they were very good, excellent, but we got
It
them.
was.
So this actually speaks to Timothy's. Again, we could talk about this, and I hope we have the opportunity to talk about this longer. But I would just say that, maybe rules-based order is not particularly stirring, but neither is the habits of international cooperation yet. So I think that we have an issue here between the principles and the pursuit of those principles. And maybe I would reveal myself too much as a realist, which I did never expected that I had to do. But I was very influenced by the exhibition that you have here in Oxford of John le Carré, which was never a thing for me because I thought this was a thing boys do. When I was growing up, it was a thing that not for a Cold War, who cares? But I went back and I watched this movie, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And there is a line there where Control says, just because our government's policies are benevolent, it doesn't mean that our beings need to be any less wicked. And I am thinking that there is a moment right now where the threats are so numerous, they're so high for the kind of interests that we have as Europeans in the world, that we might need to be occasionally interpretative of these sort of rules and preemptively strike in a way that allows us to fight in better ways another day. I don't want to be too poetic, but this is what Romania did with what I said was a creative interpretation of its constitution. It bought itself time to fight another day, otherwise it would have been lost. And I think for a place like Germany, for example, I understand we're not setting a model, but for a place like Germany to not focus seriously on everything that they need to do to potentially ban the AFD, as it is a proportional measure for the kind of threat that they impose. This is a conversation that I would like to have more in the public space as well.
So some healthy Machiavellianism coming to us from Flores.
I think there's a time for everything, and right now I'm thinking, right? Luckily, I'm not in charge of anything, so I can talk. But we have an issue with, when you send your newsletter, people read you. We are safe. So it's we have a space here to discuss what is appropriate for the times that we are.
Can I follow up quickly on that? I mean, because in a way you're not, Veronica, defending the rules. Then what you're defending is the need to bend the rules sometimes in the name of something larger. So then we need to know what the something larger is. Like, in other words, your end justification appeared to be rules-based international order. And now you're saying we need to bend the rules, or even break the rules occasionally in the name of something larger. So then you need to have a clear answer to what the something larger.
The idea of values and democracy is not.
No, that's fine.
Oh, okay.
Well, then
So
put democracy on your flag, and Richard will, wait.
Richard,
Well, no,
you think good?
not overly idealistically, but yeah, but for me, it's that larger something that's maybe a little bit lost from view. That's my. I agree that sometimes we need sharper tactics.
I think that at this point, peace would just be a good idea. I think that we have to invest in creating the kind of deterrence that we do not have. And I'm not just talking about deterrence against the conventional attacks. I'm talking about the kind of deterrence that stops the destruction of the fabric of our societies through hybrid means that our enemies are using. So the kind of peace that is the internal social contract that we will not go to, violent attacks with each other, at least in Europe. It's more than just defending. It's the kind of deterrence that we do not have in cyber, that we do not have in cognitive warfare, that we do not have in conventional attacks, that we do not have against our enemies outside. I think peace for the time being would be, maybe it's a very low bar, but without that, where's democracy?
Yeah, Jonathan Shaler, European Studies Centre, and I spent a long time, most of my professional life, working for the EU. One of the points you made, Richard, at the beginning was that I think it was you, Richard, the EU was set up, and you said nobody can conceive of an internal conflict, armed conflict within the EU. And that was certainly, I think, in the early days of the EC and ECSC, whatever, it was quite a mobilizing concept. And I was listening to Tim on the idea of a mobilizing concept. That essentially largely disappeared after the 1980s, because, and at the same time, you then had the 90s with a strong economic development, the move towards enlargement, and then the financial crisis. And suddenly the question arose, well, what is the EU for? Because it's not delivering prosperity. We completely discount the idea of internal conflict within the EU, because it was a hugely long time ago by that time. So what is the EU isn't delivering? What's it for? Listening to you, and Veronica, you talked about peace. Essentially, is the EU now there to try to prevent an externally driven war against the European, I wouldn't call them powers, the European states, the members of the European Union? Is that a mobilizing concept, which underpins Veronica's idea of total defense and so forth? Because I still think that the EU, despite the the general support for the idea of an enlarged EU, it still has a problem in explaining what it's for. What is, as Richard said, what is all this security strategy and so forth? What's it aiming to achieve?
Any other questions before we make the last round of? Okay, let me use my prerogative and shift the conversation in a different direction. Actually, bring in China. For the argument's sake, let's assume the future in 10, 15, 20 years. So it's duopoly of power, US and China. And if you think about Europe, it's somewhere in the middle because there's a very deep relationship with the US, despite alienation and decoupling. Look, you're talking about $1.5 trillion for the trade. And we might talk, but European pension funds and institutional investors are putting their cash in US assets. That might change. Down, whatever. But this is the fact of economic life. And then there's China, which might be threatening, might be supporting Russia, but at the same time, it's where technology is coming from increasingly, where we actually get our consumer products, where green transition might be drawing on depending. So we are bound to be in the middle and try to negotiate this relationship, this triangle. So I'll be curious to get your thoughts about how we go about in this China or Sino-American world when it's looking at the horizon, how to cope with it. What is the strategy if if Kaya Kallas or her successor or Ursula von der Leyen, the China head, invites you tomorrow, what would be your 5-point or 3-point?
Oh, sure. I'll try to act like a man and pretend I know anything about China.
The thing about China and other tools and others have made the point. You might not know much about it, but it's not just it's not a region. It's where the future might be happening, right? So we have to know. It concerns all of us.
So when it comes to China, 博学学生, which is one of the first. I'm trying to learn it, and that means I'm a student. So I'm very at the beginner level. I'm a student, and I know that the European Union does not have a strategy on China. I know that is a problem. I know that they are not even attempting to have a discussion on China. And again, that is where we are. We don't know anything. There was an article that came out in the Economist, I think, in the Financial Times, where said that when a EU blue suit, a EU bureaucrat goes to China for a week, and when they come back, they're treated like Marco Polo because nobody knows anything about China. And I think that to a certain extent that is correct. And we need to
I disagree actually on this one because, again, going back to what we've done properly, if you look at other powers like India, actually China, there is an epistemic community in Europe of knowledge and networks. I mean, Merrick's in Germany is a good example, but more in France and the UK, you have a network of scholars and expertise. It's just that our lot, why the Europe have to get to know China more. I think we have decent level of expertise with 50 years of relationship, which is not the case with other Asian powers. In Indonesia, India, there is a lack of understanding.
I hope you're right. On the security issue, the only thing that I can say is that if, and this is, I have data on this, if there were to be a confrontation between, over Taiwan, between China and Taiwan, with or without US involvement, in the absence of a coordinated answer among EU member states, we will only be showing more weakness towards our immediate enemy, which is Russia. So there is a transfer of weakness in a greater conflict that we can see in some of the research that I have conducted, and it would embolden Russia to go further in its security aims. So I think that's a problem that we have, and we don't have a protocol to answer.
Maybe Jonathan's question about what is EU for?
So I would push back against the idea that the EU is not delivering. At this point, it hasn't just delivered peace within its borders, which was its initial main goal, but it is also the most prosperous, it is the safest, it is the most liberal, and it is the most democratic region on earth, greater than the United States. And on all metrics, it is actually doing well. This doesn't mean that we should be complacent. And that is, the goal is, well, it's not stagnation, but what more can you ask than actually doing everything everywhere all at once, which if there is a place that is doing it, it is the European.
So I would agree. I think the narrative already for 4 or 5 years now has been that the EU is a security project. It's not the same kind of idealism as 10 or 15 years ago. And I think it's right that it is framed in that way. Clearly today there's not nearly enough as much space for the same kind of liberal idealism as 10 to 20 years ago. I think the debate then is the EU is a security project, but what do we understand by security? I think that's really where the debate is, and that's where I would have kind of issue in. It's a very, very difficult set of questions that you have to get to grips with. We all know that the EU needs more military capacity, but that's just one dimension of security. You mentioned, Veronica mentioned like climate security. There, the EU is a real leader. As early as 2008, it came up with a climate security strategy, realizing that the longer term, really big existential threat would be the security dimensions of climate change. The risk is that all that is getting crowded off the agenda at the moment. A lot of the money that was being invested in that kind of more extended definition of security is now being narrowed down into the more traditional defense budgets. So I think it will be a security project in the future, but we just need to make sure we define security in a broad enough way. And I think that's where the China issue would come in. My guess would be that over the next 20 years, the strategy, if you read the EU strategy on China, it's one of kind of pragmatic distancing, you might call it, where the EU is not going to, the EU doesn't have any more to the agenda left in China. It's probably inevitable that that's the case. Not much that the EU can do in terms of what's going on inside China. I think it just wants to de-risk to the extent that it can negotiate slightly better terms in the future, and probably position itself where it can play the US and China off rather coquettishly in the middle in the best of cases. My concern would be that the EU maps that out, or rather strategically, in a rather good way. But then all the leaders go individually to China with lots of businessmen to get very short-term business deals, immediately undermine all that careful strategizing that the EU itself has gone through. I don't think the strategy in itself is that point.
All right, great. It's a fascinating discussion. My takeaways is EU is no more vegetarian, but maybe it's not quite there in terms of becoming a full-fledged security player, which at the end of the day might not be that bad because security invites trade-offs, but also if you're a real security player, then others will be fighting back against you. But I don't think anybody feels threatened by you, except for the Russians to an extent. And Donald Trump, but it's not because of EU tanks and shells and military capacity. My other 5 cents of reflection would be that in this day and age of flux, having an entity bound by rules, norms, however bending, is a good thing, because if you have a deal with the EU, it's likely to stick and not be revised in 5 days on social media because you woke up on the wrong side of your bed. But anyways, maybe that's a place to close, and thank our speakers for fascinating discussion. And before we close, come back on the 3rd of March, we'll have a discussion with Aisha Zarafov of Cambridge University. about the heyday of international order and what went wrong with liberalism in Europe or more. Again,